It's Tuesday, the 27th of February. My name's Warren Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel. And finally, we have the final investigation report of the loss of Pakistan International Airlines Flight 8303 that occurred way back on the 22nd of May, 2020. And never before in the history of doing this channel and accident investigations have I ever seen such an egregious lack of professionalism, lack of adherence to standard operating procedures, and lack of crew resource management by any professional airline aircrew that resulted in the deaths of everybody on board this aircraft except for two people that were flung clear of the wreckage and the additional fatality of one more person on the ground. I did a whole series of videos on this accident back in 2020, which was largely demonetized by YouTube as content not suitable for all advertisers. But these videos were viewed millions of times, and especially by the folks over in Pakistan who got a much greater understanding of how far out of line this crew was from standard operating procedures. And in turn, I learned from the people in Pakistan how nepotism, favoritism, and corruption plays such a huge role in their society and is very detrimental to things like safely operating an airline. The people of Pakistan deserve better. As a matter of review, this accident happened back on the 22nd of May, 2020, at the height of the global pandemic and during Ramadan there in Pakistan. It was a relatively short flight from Lahore, Pakistan, over to Karachi with 8 crew members, 6 flight attendants, a pilot and co-pilot, and 91 passengers. They were attempting to do the ILS, a perfectly good airplane in perfectly good weather at a perfectly good airport and ILS landing system. They were trying to do the ILS to runway 25 left under visual conditions, but instead came in much too high and much too hot and landed halfway down the runway with the landing gear up, scraping the engines along the runway for several thousand feet before then deciding to initiate a go-around, and then both engines subsequently failing and the aircraft crashing just short of the runway in their attempt to come back around a box pattern and return to the runway. Here's a picture of the aircraft scraping along down the runway, scraping along on the bottom of the 2 engines where are mounted the accessory drive gearboxes, which damaged those engines and eventually caused them to fail. Here's a couple of stills from a closed circuit video of the final moments of the flight, very high angle of attack, gear down, and sinking into the very crowded neighborhood that it crashed in, just shy of runway 25 left. Lahore, where they departed, located way up here in the northeast corner of the country, coming down here to Karachi. Here's the airport they intended to land at, and note also there is a military base located right off to the west over here. They came in high and hot on their approach, scraped down on the runway about midfield, continued to scrape along the runway until just about here before initiating a go-around. They did a left-hand short box pattern in an effort to return back to the runway, and ended up crashing right about in here in this very crowded neighborhood just short of the runway. Here's the end of the runway. There's the wreckage location. And amazing that only 1 person was killed on the ground, 3 people injured on the ground. Investigators combed through the wreckage of the airplane and found only that damage that occurred from the scrape and go down the runway. No other problems with the aircraft prior to the crew hitting the runway. And remember this famous photo just prior to the crash where you can distinctly see the damage done to the bottom of the 2 engines. So this is after the scrape and go and before the crash. And also the ram air turbine, or the RAT, deployed out of the belly of the aircraft, indicating a loss of both main AC systems. In diving into the history of the pilots, they found that the captain was considered initially unfit by the psychiatrist at Pakistan International Airlines. This is when he's going to go get hired by the airlines, and was referred to the Pakistan Air Force Aeromedical Institute for a second opinion. There, his buddies in the Air Force declared him fit, and he was further referred to by a third psychiatrist, and they gave him a fit rating, and so he was hired by the airlines. And here's something I didn't know about flying in Pakistan is prior to every flight, breath analysis or test shall be conducted on all crew members and shall sign undertaking and pre-flight examination document they are not under the influence of any psychoactive substances. The fact that this accident occurred during Ramadan means most people, including the crew, are fasting throughout the day. But international regulations prevent air crews from fasting, and there is not a lot of information on this at Pakistan International Airlines prior to the accident. However, since the accident, they have added additional rules regarding fasting and flying. They don't mix. By the time of the accident, the captain had accumulated over 17,000 hours of flying experience. He made captain in 2015, 58 years old, and he was appointed as a standards inspector on the A320. Earlier in his career, he was considered for a supervisory assignment while he was flying the ATR aircraft, what we would call check airman here in the States, but was not recommended during the evaluation due to lack of technical knowledge and general awareness. Now, according to an aviation psychologist analysis dated on 29 June 22, he says that the captain was bossy in nature, firm, dominant, and overbearing. He had below average intelligence. He tends to have little regard for authority. He had low mechanical comprehension with low comprehension of space relations. His level of stress tolerance was also quite inadequate. The first officer had 2,291 hours of flying time, 33 years old. He had few observations on his flying performance during his initial checks on the ATR aircraft as first officer. He was endorsed with 3 SB satisfactory with briefing entries in his check ride for abnormal and emergency procedures and pilot assessment, execution, and adherence. In 2014, he was again endorsed with 5 SBs, satisfactory with briefing. That means either you do it right or you do it over, or you get a very long briefing. In 2015, he was put under observation by a PCAA inspector, and based on those promotions, his promotion to first officer on the A320 was initially withheld during a promotion board conducted in February of 2016. He was later subsequently cleared for promotion and completed his training successfully on the A320 and cleared to fly as first officer. So a little bit of a checkered past in both of these pilots' training records. So we have 2 pilots with a bit of a checkered past in their training history, flying during Ramadan, during COVID, and they're very distracted with the pandemic going on right now because CVR analysis revealed that the cockpit environment was conducive and cordial, but throughout the flight crew continued discussion on various topics, including the topic of the pandemic. However, there was no indication of any fear or compulsion to fly during the pandemic, but they continued to talk about this to well below 10,000 feet, which is in violation of the sterile cockpit rule. And this sets off the entire snowball of events here, this distraction. So here's a look at the plan that they're supposed to fly. They're supposed to fly this NH-2A arrival from the NHVOR to this point here, and then over to Mockley, which gets them lined up for the ILS to 25 left. They subsequently get re-cleared direct to Mockley, which resembles the NH-1 Charlie arrival. So that cuts the corner, and the crew is distracted in the cockpit, and they are late to start their descent. But they've also miscalculated this. When you get into this approach here on ILS 25 left, if you are not down to 3,000 feet by Sabin here, you are meant to descend in a holding pattern at Sabin, and that holding pattern is built into the FMS, the flight management system. So prior to the top of the descent, the crew fails to do a descent briefing, which would have explained the plan so that everybody was on the same page on how to get into this airport. Prior to the descent, they found that the first officer was the pilot flying. Now, we'll see that he's also doing the radio calls, which is a bit unconventional to how things are done here in the States. But the FO was the pilot flying and the captain was the pilot monitoring. Here at 9:15:00, the FO requests the ATC for descent, and ATC gives them a descent to 10,000 feet and proceed direct now to Mockley, cutting the corner a little bit. The flight crew initiated the descent from flight level 340, 34,000 feet. The selected altitude was changed to 10,000 feet and descent mode was engaged. Now this is Airbus stuff. Descent mode means he sets the altitude in the altitude window and he pushes the altitude button. That's what's known as a managed descent in the Airbus vernacular. And so the Airbus, with the autopilot on, is going to fly the pre-programmed vertical navigation profile that's in the box. Now here's what's in the box that apparently the crew is unaware of, as you'll see coming up here. And this mistake could have been easily captured had they done a prior to descent cruise briefing. So in the box is the holding pattern at Sabin, and with the idea of descending in the holding pattern to get down to the 3,000 feet at Sabin in order to be at the proper altitude to conduct the approach. But this, right now, the FMS has them crossing Sabin at 8,900 feet. So that's the managed descent profile that this autopilot is going to fly. A managed descent down to 8,900 feet, well, to 10,000 feet right now, because that's what they got in the altitude window. But it's going to follow this VNAV profile. It's not going to take them down to 3,000 feet to Sabin. They're going to be much too high here shortly. And two more clues to this is in the nav display here prior to Mockley, there's a left-hand turn indicated here at Sabin. And once you cross Mockley and Sabin becomes the active waypoint, the entire holding pattern with a solid line appears with the idea of descending in the holding pattern before starting the instrument approach. So they get cleared direct to Mockley. Here's what the nav display looks like. And this is where you've got to always check what you're putting into the autopilot. The inputs that you put into the autopilot are read out right here at the top of the nav display, and you are to cross-check that with each other. But there is no discussion of cleared direct Mockley. How does that look? That looks good. And verification between the two crew members. By the way, this window is the status of the auto throttles or auto thrust. We're talking Airbus here versus Boeing, so we got to get our terminology right. Those are thrust levers, not throttles. Over here is the vertical mode of the autopilot, and over here is indicated the lateral mode of the autopilot. And anytime any of these change, you're supposed to note that between the two crew members. So they get the clearance from Karachi approach to 5,000 feet. Thrust mode engaged, N1 reduced idle on both engines, which indicated the aircraft was starting to capture the FMS descent profile, and the vertical speed increased to 2,400 feet per minute, and the calibrated airspeed increased to 284 knots before reducing towards the managed target airspeed of 269 knots. So in this mode, the aircraft is pitching itself to maintain the descent profile, allowing the airspeed to increase just to maintain the pitch. The descent. The auto thrust mode changed to idle mode to adjust the thrust while the autopilot followed the descent profile. The selected altitude window became 5,000 feet. And again, there was no FMA call out or altitude call out by the pilots. Anytime you change the altitude, it's 5,000 feet, set, checked. Instead, the flight crew were discussing various topics not related to this phase of flight. And this really gets snowballing out of control. Next, there's a mistuned radio frequency, and this is real common. It happens all the time. They tuned up 126.5 instead of 125.5, so Karachi approach gets on guard. 121.5 gets a hold of the air crew and gets them sorted out and back on the correct radio frequency. Again, it was observed via the cockpit voice recorder that during this time, both flight crew members were busy in discussion things not relevant to the phase of flight. They're talking all about the distraction of the pandemic. At 09:25:54, Karachi approach clears them down to 3,000 feet with a barometric altimeter setting of 1004 hectopascals, and they set the altimeter But again, no call out between the two pilots of the resetting of the altitude to 3,000 feet. At 092953, the approach guidance modes were armed. They armed the approach, glide slope, and localizer. Now, this is the wrong move if you're going to descend in that holding pattern. You need to remain in nav mode if you're going to descend in this holding pattern. But apparently the crew is not planning to do that. But they're much too high to just simply go straight in. Again, there was no cross-check of the change in status of the autopilot by the crew members. All the while, the vertical descent profile of the aircraft is flying the profile to cross Sabin at 8,900 feet, not the 3,000 feet as needed before starting the ILS approach. At 093035, after the aircraft passed Mach Lee at 9,363 feet, way too high, and 245 knots calibrated airspeed and the flaps at 0, Karachi approach asked Pakistan 8303, confirmed track mile comfortable for descent, to which PIA 8303 said affirmative. Aircraft was still around 9,000 feet altitude and just 15 miles away from the runway 25 left threshold. In the CVR recording, the captain exclaimed, "What has happened? Stop, stop. Oh, take out the hold, take out the hold, take out the hold," 3 times. And he's using the local language of Urdu between the two of them. The FO responded, "Hold taken out. Should we report this?" And the captain replied, "No, this could be due to the hold. Tell Karachi approach, established on localizer." So now, much too late in the game, they've decided to continue this approach straight in, capturing the localizer with the aircraft much too high and hot. Here is the desired descent profile down here. You're meant to come down to Mach Lee at 3,000 feet, so you hit Sabin at 3,000 feet, which will set you up nice for the ILS. Instead, they're way up here trying to capture the ILS from above. Now, what do? How do you capture an ILS from above if you're going to continue to use the autopilot? Well, one thing is, of course, you can always click it off and manually fly it down. But if you're going to use the autopilot, you got to use vertical speed. But these guys are so high that almost no amount of vertical speed that they would roll into that window would be enough to capture this glide slope. So what does this crew elect to do? They make another huge mistake in regards to standard operating procedures, and instead they pull open the open descent mode of the autopilot while on final, which is what you're not supposed to do. So open descent mode, if you pull on the altitude knob as opposed to push it, you are now just doing an idle descent down to whatever altitude you have set in the altitude window, regardless of any intermediate fixes or regardless of any approach guidance, vertical guidance from the FMS. At this point, the aircraft is at 9,200 feet, just little less than 15 miles away from the airport. Now, just using the general 3-to-1 rule, 3, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15, that's 5. You should be at 5,000 feet at 15 miles, not 9,000 feet, so they're almost twice as high as they need to be. Now Karachi Tower gets a hold of Karachi Approach on the hotline and says, "Sir, the flight 8303 is too high." And Approach says, "Yeah, too high, I'm observing it, and will give an orbit," which means they're going to command them to get into the holding pattern to descend. Then Karachi Approach calls Pakistan 8303, report level passing. Flight crew replied, out of 7,500 for 3,000 feet. So here they are at 11 miles at a flight path angle of greater than 6 degrees when they need to be at 3 degrees. At 11 miles, Approach prompts the 8303, 75 for 3,000 feet. The present position is 10 miles from touchdown, so he's trying to remind the aircrew that you're too high, too close to the airport. But the flight crew responds, "No problem, sir." So because the approach was armed, the localizer is captured. That's your precision approach guidance for your lateral guidance into the runway. But they're at an altitude much too high, again, to capture the glide slope, the vertical precision guidance into the runway. So the aircraft trajectory was not challenged by the flight crew, and there was no mental picture of the flight path, even after being prompted by ATC, lack of situational awareness. Rather, the flight crew just verbalized that the situation was all under control. At 7,400 feet altitude and 10.8 miles from the runway, The target speed was selected to 248 knots, and the landing gear was selected to the down position. Remember, there's some gear limit speeds on these aircraft as well. Neither the pilot flying nor the pilot monitoring verbalized the selection of the landing gear lever to the down position, and there was no cross-check. You always work together to lower the landing gear. Now, with the landing gear out, the speed brakes out, and the flaps 1 selected, the rate of descent increases from 2,300 feet per minute to 7,500 feet per minute while on final with the autopilot engaged. Now Karachi approach calls 8303 for the 3rd time. Sir, orbit is available if you want. The captain verbalized, say it's okay. After 6 seconds, the FO replied to ATC. Again, he's flying and doing the radios. Negative, sir. We are comfortable. We can make it, inshallah. Now, because of the high rate of descent, the autopilot begins to capture the 3,000-foot altitude that was set in the altitude window at 4,100 feet, and the target speed was reduced from 248 knots to 230 knots. But again, no call out between the crew on any of this. As the autopilot begins to capture 3,000 feet, the crew thinks they're back on the target descent profile, and the captain says to the FO, he will be surprised what we have done. Probably captain was referring to the ATC controller during this discussion with the FO, indicating overconfidence and complacency. And again, Karachi approach tries a 4th call. He commands the crew of 8303, disregard, turn left, heading 180. Now that's a pretty poorly way of vectoring a guy off the approach. If you want to be more specific about that, you got to say something along the lines of Pakistan 8303, cancel approach clearance, turn left 180 degrees, altitude 3,000 feet. You got to be more specific than that. And here's about the location of the flight crew at this time. They're on a 6-degree glide path instead of the desired 3-degree glide path. And once again, the crew blows off the traffic controller, saying, sir, we are comfortable now. We are out of 3,500 feet for 3,000 feet, established ILS 25 left. Now, it's right about in here that the crew captures something that's called a false glide slope. The glide slope is a beam that's at 3 degrees, but this electronic beam also posts ghost beams at 6 degrees and 9 degrees. And sometimes this automation can capture the false glide slope. And in this case, it appears that the automation captured the 6-degree glide slope and gave the FMA display that the glide slope was captured, when it in fact was capturing the 6-degree glide slope, much too high, versus the actual glide slope at 3 degrees. This is another reason why when you are doing these precision approaches, you need to cross-check your altitude at these crossing points, that you're at the correct altitude, for example at Sabin 3,000 feet or at DME 6.1 at 2,000 feet, to be on the correct altitude, the correct glide path for your ILS approach. Now just 5.7 nautical miles from the runway, the airspeed's still 242 knots. The nose is buried down here at 12.6 degrees. Karachi approach tries for the 6th time now. Sir, you are 5 miles from touchdown, still passing 3,500 feet. And the crew responds, Roger. Now it's at this point that the Airbus logic can no longer keep up with what's going on. And once the pitch reaches a 13.7 degrees nose low, the autopilot automatically disconnects. Anytime the pitch exceeds 13 degrees nose low, this low to the ground, the autopilot automatically disconnects. You're on your own. The rate of descent picks up to 6,800 feet per minute, and nobody on the crew deck acknowledges that the autopilot disconnected or who has control of the aircraft. About 4 seconds later, all the overspeed warnings begin. First, we get an overspeed for the flaps. Then we start getting the jip whiz alerts, the ground proximity warning system for sink rate, pull up, all of which is ignored by the crew. Then at 0932.57, with nobody saying anything to each other on the CVR, the landing gear is inexplicably retracted. But here it explains why they think the landing gear was retracted. And they're still getting the overspeed warnings for the flaps. Later on the CVR, it's heard that the FO was saying, should we do the orbit? To which the captain said, no, leave it. But this communication indicated to the accident investigators that the FO, who presumably was flying the aircraft, was intending to finally give up and do an orbit and slow down. And so it's presumed that the first officer raised the landing gear and the speed brakes. Then a fight over the controls basically ensues. The captain takes over the controls by pressing the side stick push button. Again, this is Airbus, 2 side stick controllers. If these 2 side stick controllers are not connected to each other, you cannot feel what the other pilot is doing in an Airbus aircraft. If there is a dual input, conflicting inputs into these side stick controllers, you'll get a dual input warning, and it'll show you that on the instrument panel. But the captain or any pilot can take over by hitting the, we'll call it the pledge override switch. By pressing the side stick push button, you can take over the side stick controller regardless of what the other pilot's doing. And so the captain does that. And again, nobody says my aircraft, I've got the aircraft or anything. He just starts taking over control of the aircraft. And so here they are at 1,000 feet, at 220 knots, 1,800 feet per minute, 5 degrees nose low, and still 2 dots above the glide slope, just boring in for the end of the runway. So they're 75 knots too fast, they're 800 feet per minute, too much rate of descent, and 2.5 degrees too far too nose low. Completely and totally unstabilized at 1,000 feet. And there, again, is no call out for the unstabilized approach. Mandatory call out would be to go around. Now they start getting the warnings for the landing gear not down. Again, completely disregarded by the crew. Overspeed warnings for the flaps. At 500 feet, they're still 220 knots, 2,000 feet per minute down, 5.6 degrees nose low, and still 2 dots above glide slope. And again, no call from the flight crew about being stabilized or unstabilized or go around. Mandatory call, go around. Both of these should have been captured at these 2 points, 1,000 feet and 500 feet. It's right there in the books. Now with the captain hand flying the aircraft thinks it's about to crash into the terrain, so it starts getting the too low terrain, sink rate, too low terrain, pull up, all the various jip whiz warnings, completely disregarded by the crew. And then they cross the runway threshold at 7 feet on the radar altimeter, 200 knots, calibrated airspeed, full reverse thrust is selected on both engines. Well, you don't have the landing gear down. You're not in the landing configuration. The engines will not go into reverse thrust while the aircraft is still airborne. Yet, nonetheless, he pulls reverse thrust. But because the aircraft was not configured for landing, the engines simply remained at idle thrust and the thrust reversers remained blocked. They did not deploy. And they got another ECAM alert for that. Now the fight for control of the aircraft really begins at 093428. Both engine nacelles made contact with the runway. They hit the runway about halfway down the runway. And maximum brake pedal inputs and opposite side stick inputs were recorded from both flight crew members. The captain was pushing full nose down input, and the FO, the first officer, was pulling 2/3 full back input. And both of them, or somebody's honking on the brakes that don't exist because the gear's not down. Somewhere during this time period, the engine number 2 fire alert triggered for about 10 seconds with an associated master warning. At 093442, the FO said, "Take off, sir, take off." And 2 seconds later, at 160 knots calibrated airspeed, both thrust levers were advanced to the toga position for a go-around, and the aircraft got airborne at 093445, right at those intersections towards the end of the runway. Now, somewhere in this process, in the more technical analysis, in the higher portion of the report here, the number 2 engine got itself into a shutdown mode. And once they established the thrust levers up to toga, the number 2 engine started a restart or a relight. As the aircraft scraped down the runway, significant damage was done to the accessory drive section of the engine, including the transfer gearbox, where a hole was scraped right into the bottom of the transfer gearbox, and so both engines began losing oil very quickly. After the go-around, the crew continues to flail even worse. At 59 feet radar altitude, a third GIPWIZ alert indicated too low gear, amber caution, and 5 seconds later, the crew instantly selected the landing gear lever down and back up. There was no duration, it was too short, so it didn't physically the gear remained up. Now at 093612, the confusion over the engines begins. At 3,100 feet radar altimeter, the number 2 thrust lever was reduced to idle, whereas the number 1 thrust lever was kept at max continuous climb thrust setting. At 3,000 feet RA, the number 1 engine went into an uncommanded in-flight shutdown. So the number 1 engine detected the loss of oil pressure and shut itself down. The number 2 engine was at idle. The number 2 engine remained at idle for about 1 minute until the flight crew eventually realized it and the thrust lever was re-advanced. So the massive confusion from the scrape and go. Apparently the number 2 engine went into a restart mode and did briefly have a fire indication in there. Maybe that was why they decided to move the number 2 thrust lever to idle. But then when number 1 engine shut down and the number 2 was left at idle for 1 minute, this sealed their fate. They simply did not have enough energy to continue on the one remaining number 2 engine, which is not going to last much longer anyways. After 1 minute and 18 seconds, the number 2 engine was operating at 65% nominal speed. Multiple stall warnings were triggered, and thereafter, and the aircraft was continuously dropping. The landing gear was selected down. And then there was the sound of impact. Prior to this accident, Pakistan Airlines did not have an adequate flight monitoring data program in place. Here in the States, we got this program called FOQA, Flight Operations Quality Assurance, that operates under the basic premise that, will you behave differently if you know you're being watched all the time? FOQA watches you all the time in real time. When you're flying one of these Part 121 airliners today, everything is recorded in real time, all this data that we've just gone through. And anytime there is an exceedance in any of this data, it is flagged and recorded, and you will get a notification or a phone call as to what was going on with you exceeding that data. This way, operators can capture all the data that's going on day to day and can capture trends. And what they did not capture at Pakistan Airlines was the trend for unstable approaches. Prior to the accident, PIA only observed less than 5% of the data that was available. After the accident, they went back and reviewed 12 months of data and found that there were numerous triggers during approach related to high speed, path high, high rate of descent, long flare distance, and GIPWIZ warnings. And many times there was no go-around initiated and several unstabilized approaches were continued. Regarding crew resource management, Pakistan Airlines has the same CRM training as other airlines, but upon further review of additional data after this accident, they found that flight crew actions, aircraft trajectory, and CVR recordings highlighted inadequate level of CRM application of both flight crew members. There were numerous deviations from standard operating procedures, required briefings were not conducted, and several alerts and warnings were either ignored, not verbalized, or canceled. Concerns by EASA, the European Agency's Safety Administration, over Pakistan Airlines' safety monitoring system led to a round of discussions, and finally, due to a lack of progress along these lines, EASA suspended their third country operator certificate, I presume in Europe, on the 1st of July 2020. For you Airbus guys, you'll be interested to know that despite all this mayhem, the aircraft stayed in normal law for the complete duration of the recording. So it never went into alternate law or direct law, despite all this damage to the aircraft. So as a result of this accident and this report, there are quite a few desperately needed safety recommendations on behalf of Pakistan International Airlines and the Pakistan Civil Aviation Authority. Will these changes take place? The people of Pakistan deserve better. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible, because most of this content was largely demonetized by YouTube during the time of this accident in 2020, but the information still got out thanks to the folks over on Patreon. Thank you so much for your support. See you here.